Hello everyone, welcome to Painting Crafty. In today's creative idea, I'm going to be crafting and showing you how you can create a paper mache snowman. I'm also a part of a YouTube collaboration called Candy Cane Lane. We have 3 hosts today. We have Monica with Up All Night DIY, Annie with Indie Annie Jones, and Dawn with Shabby Meets Bling. You're going to find the links to their channels inside of the description box, as well as all of the other creators who are participating in today's collaboration. Definitely take some time, check out that playlist. I'm sure you're going to be inspired to create something fun for your holiday season. Well, let's get started. I can't wait to show you how I created these paper mache clay. Oh my goodness, super hard to say. Well, let's get crafting.
To create the paper mache part of my snowman, I used a recipe that I found at the ultimatepapermache.com. Joni is a great artist, and she's developed this paper clay recipe using some simple materials. She has lots of recipes on there for different types of paper mache, so definitely check out the link down in the description box if you decide you would like to make one of these paper mache snowmen. I only mixed a half a batch, which is more than enough to make one snowman. This paper clay is not a clay that you would handle a lot with your hands. It's more of a spreadable clay that you're going to be using a knife to spread with, but it dries super strong. For the paper mache piece I was going to be creating, I was just going to be creating the head and face for a snowman, so I used a styrofoam ball as the base to be able to build on. By adding the wooden dowel to the base, it functions like a handle, and you'll have something to hang on to while the clay is wet, and you can work on your snowman all the way around it. It also acts as something that you can go ahead and mount it into a piece of styrofoam when you need to dry your piece. I was going to be creating some 3D elements for my face, and I was going to be using a heavy-duty aluminum foil to create them out of. My first shape I created was a nose, and I created it in the carrot shape first, and then I used a very inexpensive masking tape to cover my aluminum foil. Because this nose protrudes out and it's a smaller shape, the masking tape is just going to hold my aluminum foil in slightly, make it a little bit smoother and easier for me to get it covered with my paper mache clay covered on there. I wanted to go ahead and add a 3D cheek as well, and I made it out of the heavy-duty aluminum foil again and folded my paper back on itself. Oh, by the way, if you use that masking roll to use as a holder to put your little snowman in, it's not going to roll around on you, and it works perfectly to hold your piece. To do the cheeks, I simply folded the piece over and created kind of a little bit of a big eye look when I put my pieces down. That's a good shape to go for, is that like a nose and 2 really large eyes. To be able to meld my pieces back closer to my styrofoam ball, I pushed them back with my thumbs first, and then I used the end of my wooden tool there, or the palette knife, the wooden end, and I used that to smooth it out. You could probably use a spoon for this as well, but I'm pushing that aluminum foil back to meld it closer to my styrofoam ball and smooth that little aluminum foil out just a little bit more. I'm using a 4-inch styrofoam ball that I purchased at the Dollar General store. It's the bumpy kind of styrofoam. It's not super smooth. It accepts the paper clay really, really well. I'm using a palette knife to go ahead and spread the paper clay on, but you could use a butter knife easily as well too. It does work well to go ahead and add just a little bit of water every now and then to your knife and go ahead and smooth out your plaster. We're not looking for a thick layer at all when we're putting our plaster on. We're just working it across our little piece, not looking for perfect. We're going to have some irregular spaces, and that's okay. Our tendency is to cover everything up so you don't see anything right away, but just go slow, do a thin layer, and you're going to get a better product in the end. Your plaster will dry quicker, you won't get any cracks in it, and it's a super strong clay plaster. When you get to the nose, just use your knife and spread it over it, and take a little bit of time here. You want to make sure your joint has the plaster all the way scooping down. That's what's going to add the strength to this piece. The glue underneath isn't acting like a permanent glue. It's just acting more of a temporary. It's the paper clay on top that's going to make it more permanent. Now it's time to go ahead and dry it. Stick it in that piece, and we're going to go ahead and dry. I didn't use very much plaster at all. My setup is I put it in a little bit of a box, a small box, turned a fan on, and let it dry. In usually about a couple hours, your piece should be fairly dry all the way around. Squeeze that nose to make sure it's hard. It may not be completely hard on this layer, but you definitely want it to be dry. I'm going to go ahead and sand it slightly, get any of the little burrs off from the plaster, and go ahead and spread another layer. This time around, you're still going to be using a thin layer. You still may see the darkness of the aluminum foil underneath, but we're going to be able to paint this and that will go away. So again, use just a thin layer of your plaster and let it dry one more time. Paper mache will last a very long time. The process part of letting your piece dry is what's going to make the piece more permanent. So here I have another one set up again and letting it dry. That time I added a little bit of heat to make it dry a little bit faster. To get that little area sanded by the nose, I wrapped some sandpaper around a pen and went in and sanded that area. The piece is going to feel smooth, but it's going to have an irregular texture, and it's going to work perfectly to add that antique feel to my snowman. I went ahead and I started the painting process. I used the color bright orange in the Deco Art color to create the nose. I did 2 layers on the nose, and then once it was dry, I went ahead and started with the white part of my snowman. I liked using the flat brush to be able to go right around the nose, and if your area gets a little bit up onto your nose where you don't want it, a Q-tip works perfectly to remove, a wet Q-tip anyway, works perfectly to remove that painted area that you don't want. To create the little bit of a texture, I'm going to be adding an underpainting on my snowman. Yep, I'm going to make him look dirty, but in the end he doesn't look dirty. I'm using the colors Raw Umber and Burnt Umber in the Deco Art color. And I'm going to water down my paint and then spread it over my snowman, use a baby wipe and tap it back, and I'm creating that darker tone colors underneath my snowman. I'm also going to be picking up some of that texture that's underneath that you don't quite see that much when it's all white. He looks kind of funny now. He does look like he fell in the mud puddle, but he's going to look great in the end. I also put those darker colors over his nose, and that will help pick up that texture that's underneath there. Yep, he's looking pretty good. Now, depending on how much antiquing you like, depends on how much white you're going to be putting on this next layer. I also watered down my white paint just a little bit, and I went ahead and put the white paint on, and then I wiped it back with the baby wipe. You might decide you want to leave your white paint on a little bit heavier. It all depends on what you're looking for. I did dry it down, and I did put another layer of white on the top just to soften those undertones, but I didn't want them to go all the way. I still wanted to see that variance of color underneath. It's kind of a dance in between of putting color on and taking color off. Up next was going to add those blushing cheeks. I'm using 2 different colors to blush my cheeks. I'm using the color and the apple barrel color called Tuscan Red. That's my first color, and I'm applying the color on really in a dry brush manner. I like putting the color on the brush, then rubbing it off on my palette, and then rubbing it into my hand so I can see when it's completely dry, that more dry feeling. And then when I use it that way, I can know that it's going to be a light touch of paint and not so heavy when I do it this way. The peachy pink color I'm using is called Light Magenta in the Liquitex color. It's a great little color on top of that brighter red, and it really does soften that underneath. I do the same process of putting some on the brush, rubbing it on my palette, and then into my hand. I knew I wanted to go ahead and have a fur element on this hat, so I had purchased a little fur hat from my local thrift store, and I was going to be using that for the fur element on his little hat. Here I'm just marking where I want to put my eyes, so I have an idea of where I wanted to paint them. I'm going to be creating just a simple oval eye. When I do eyes, I like the tops to be facing each other and the bottoms to be going the opposite direction on the bottom. It's just a nice look in the end to have those eyes slightly in and coming out. Now I'm going to go ahead and antique up my snowman. Yep, I'm going to add another color. I'm using some instant coffee for this. It was about a tablespoon of instant coffee in about a 1/3 cup of warm water. And I'm just going to splash that color all over my snowman and cover him completely. And then I'm going to go ahead and soften back just a little bit with a baby wipe, a drier kind of baby wipe, not a lot of water on this stage. I'm also actually going to take a little bit of the granulation of the actual instant coffee, and I'm going to sprinkle some of that on there, creating some darker marks on top of my snowman. There's something about when you dry the instant coffee with a heat tool, which I'm going to be using, kind of deepens the tone of the instant coffee. I also, during this drying process, I come in and I just kind of more concentrate that coffee right on the cheeks, adding a different kind of an aging look to those color of my cheeks. And I really like the way it turned out. To create the eyes, the first step I do is go ahead and I base coated them in black using the color called Ebony in the Americana paint, but you could use any black you had. I'm using a round brush to do this technique in, but you could use whatever you feel comfortable painting with. When I use a round brush, I like to dip my paintbrush in the paint, twist and pull it back towards myself, creating a nice tip on the point of my brush. This is just going to help create these smaller shapes easier when I'm painting them. Once they're all filled in with the black, I go ahead and dry them before I add the next step of floating the blue color into his eyes. I'm going to be creating the blue area in his eyes by using a water floating technique. I dip my brush into my water, tap it on my paper towel till I see the shine gone, tip my brush into the paint, and then walk my paint back and forth through my brush. That's going to create the floating color from dark until light. I come up to my eye and do like an upside down U shape with my paintbrush. I'm painting with an angle brush at this stage. You might want to keep a damp Q-tip by your side. If you get your floating color way off onto the side of your little snowman face, you can easily use a Q-tip and then wipe that area. To add even a little bit more dimension on my eyes, I'm going to create a watercolor float on the outside of my eyes using the color of burnt umber. I'm using an angle brush for this, and I'm starting at an angle and then scooping around, creating like little C shapes around my eyes. This is going to create a nice little shadow around those eyes. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to be doing another floated shade of color around them. Here I'm picking up the dark color raw umber, and I'm creating a water float around his nose, just adding a little bit more of a shadow line to bring out that carrot nose, even a little bit more. After giving those colors a dry, I took the color Admiral Blue and the Apple Barrel paint and gave another floated color of blue into the bottom of my eye. I swooped across underneath that lighter shade of blue, creating that bright blue, dark blue shade of blue underneath there. I used a little bit of a damp Q-tip to clean up any of the areas I might have gotten onto my white. And now here I'm going ahead and adding the darker shade of another float color in the raw umber color, adding even a little bit more dimension to my eyes. I'm adding a little bit of that color on the inside as well. You can always soften those colors with your fingers if you need to, and again, take that damp Q-tip and soften any areas you might need. Up next, I'm going to be adding some mixed media elements to my eyes. I love the rich quality this brings to my eyes. I'm going to be using the Kimberly 9XXB pencil. It's a very soft graphite pencil. It looks a little bit like charcoal. I love using this pencil to add line work to my eyes. It's so much easier for me to use than a paintbrush, and I love the line quality of it. I forgot to add those bright highlights, so I'm going in right now with a little bit of white paint and a stylist. I choose the size that I want. Usually the larger highlight is at the top of the eye, so I'm going to go ahead and just put a dot on the one side of my eye, and then I put it on the opposite side of the eye next to it. I'm also going to put in a couple smaller ones, so I have a different size stylus, and I add 2 tiny little dots to the outsides of the bottom of each eye. It's those highlights that bring those eyes to life, so you need to have them. I go ahead and give them a quick dry because those little dots, even though they're small, are still thick and wet. So I give them a quick dry before I do any other element into my eye. I use that pencil to create the little eyelashes by doing little wiggly marks at the top and then scooping around the bottom. And this is when a happy little accident happened. Because my eyes were still warm from my heat tool, when I used the woody crayon, it melted and I was able to smear it with the tip of my finger. It also worked the same way with the Sharpie China marker. It is also wax base, so I heated up my cheeks and then drew my little spirals on there, and it just smoothed across my surface quite easily by heating it up, and then it was warm and it just slid right across and made the line work pretty easy. Not all accidents are happy, but this one looks really great and I do like the way it looks and I will use it in the future. To finish his face, I used that pencil again and I created those little tiny eyebrows. It works great for adding that detail, so much nicer than using the harsher black. I had one other experimental thing I wanted to try with this project. I wanted to go ahead and create a wire smile for this little snowman. I had some jewelry wire, which is very easily molded and lightweight, so I decided I would use that. And I had a very small stapler that Tim Holtz makes. I went ahead and I stapled the tops of the cheeks to the aluminum foil area, figuring I'd have a nice solid surface to go ahead and staple it into, and then I applied 3 more at the base. Once I had the staples in, I went ahead and painted them a little darker with a little bit of paint, and then added some tacky glue on the top just to make sure that they stuck, and it worked perfect. The fabric I used for his hat is called red ticking fabric. I coffee stained it first. I baked it in the oven to give it those rich tones of the color. You don't have to bake the fabric. You can always let it air dry, but there is something about baking fabric with the coffee stain that just gives it a texture and a look that you just can't get unless you bake it. Now look at how cute that fur is going to look around the top. I went ahead and added a little bit of hot glue, and I thought that the fur would look the best if it was pointing down. It seems like this fun fur that I'm using had a direction to it, so I just wanted to make sure it was facing down and not up. It looked better that way, I guess. I went around all the way around the back, and then when I did the fabric, I just went ahead and glued it straight up, creating a sleeve kind of like for my hat, I guess. Once I had it all attached, I took some polyfill and stuffed a little bit of my hat. I didn't want it to be all the way flat up against his head, so adding the polyfill just added just a little bit more dimension to his hat. Once I had decided how much polyfill I wanted in there, I took some jute twine and tied the end of the hat off, creating more of a area to create more of a pom-pom area. So I went ahead and I tied it off with some jute, and then I glued it on with some hot glue so it was facing down and not straight up. Once I had that part done, I decided I wanted to kind of fringe the fabric, and I had wished that I had done that before I had glued it on. But I was still able to do it. I just cut some slits into the fabric and then ripped it so it gave it kind of a nice little frayed edge to the fabric. To balance off the other side of the hat, I took some sprigs of greenery and a few berries and a pine cone and glued it onto that other end just to add a little bit of balance to that opposite side of his hat. Does it look like it's fur, or does it look like he has hair? Let me know in the comments. It's cracking me up. I wanted to create a fabric collar for this guy, so I took some fabric and a needle and thread and just went back and forth on the edge to create a ruffle collar. In the end, I didn't use the red and white fabric, just more of a simple one, but I still like the look of the collar. For the base, I used a nut can, covered it with some paper. I put in a little bit of styrofoam in the bottom to be able to stick him in and added some rocks for some weight. For the finishing touches, I added a little bit of greenery, put his little collar on, and then poked him inside. Well, let's see what he looks like all set up with some of the other items I've been creating on my channel for this winter Christmas holiday season. I wanted to say a special thank you to our hosts today, Monica, Dawn, and Annie, for putting together today this fun candy cane collaboration. Make sure you check out their channels inside of the description box, as well as check out that playlist. I'm sure you're going to find a bunch of creative ideas from today's playlist. If you're new to my channel and you like to do art and crafts, come on over and see what I do there. I'd love to have new creative friends join me. Make sure you do all the things, like, comment, and share. I so appreciate it when you do. Hopefully you'll come back and see me again, and next time you'll create right along with me.